Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to take a call or two on clauses 102 and 103 in Part 6. Well, I'm not sure it is in Part 6, but I'm particularly focused on 102 and 103, if it's all right with my colleague. And I'd say it's my right to be focused on whatever clauses I jolly well want.
Keep your eye on the game.
I think Mr. Mallard is angling for a job as a whip, but he's doing his job pretty well. Hey, look, he wants Jerry's job. He wants Jerry's job. Well, you know, that brings to mind the question that's fascinated philosophers for many, many years. If Jerry Brownlee is the third smartest guy in the National Party, and I need not finish the sentence. I need not, because in fact, the reason we are all here enjoying our time together in the House is twofold. One, the abhorrent SOP in this bill, and two, the organisational genius of said Jerry Brownlee, who's completely mishandled the order paper by dumping a huge, huge collection of bills. And this is only number 2. This is only the second bill up. Members opposite will be here all weekend, I fear. But anyway, back to clauses 102 and 103. Now, what's interesting about these clauses, which amend sections 86 I and L of the Stamp and Cheque Duties Act 1971, is that they're amended to introduce references to an exemption under a double tax agreement. These relate to the non-resident withholding tax rules of the Income Tax Act 2007. And the context is that they have recently concluded double tax treaties with Australia and the United States, which includes a new exemption from source company tax for interest derived by banks. Now, together with Clause 79, these clauses clarify the circumstances in which a person is eligible to pay the approved issuer levy, as my colleague Mr. Nash has just said. They make clear that the borrower can pay approved issuer levies in order to qualify for an exemption under a DTA, even if paying the levy makes no difference to the way the transaction is dealt with under domestic law. Now, that is to clarify an uncertainty that existed when the DTA was written. And that brings us right there to a very, very important point. And that is that the process by which the underlying double tax agreements have been negotiated and brought through the House is itself deeply flawed. Now, there's a huge irony, and I'll explain why in a minute, but there's a huge irony in having to introduce by stealth a massive amendment, part of which, by supplementary order paper, which has not gone to the Finance Expenditure Committee, is to correct mistakes or ambiguities in double tax agreements which supposedly had. Now, our Labor team has been arguing consistently in the Finance and Expenditure Committee that the process of examination of double tax agreements is fundamentally flawed. It is flawed because there is an oxymoron called a national interest analysis. Why do I say it's an oxymoron? Because it's neither national nor a good definition of interests, nor is there much analytical content. These tend to be once over lightly narrative descriptions of the treaty which has been under negotiation. They are brought to the committee late in the process, after the negotiation has concluded, and before it is ratified by the House. But when members of Parliament in a select committee ask difficult and searching questions about the balance of interests in the DTA, we receive a stock of standard responses. The first one is, don't bother your pretty little heads about it, it's already been done and dusted, and it would be improper to intervene. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not what standing orders prescribe. Standing orders prescribe, in fact very explicitly prescribe for, a detailed and rigorous select committee examination under about a dozen different sub-clauses. Because these clauses are re-amending ambiguities which arose in the Australian and United States double tax treaties, which went through the same committee this should have gone through, but which did not receive thorough enough examination for exactly the reasons that I'm about to go on and describe. Now, what were those reasons? What are the flaws?
You're regretting interjecting now.
Well, the member opposite has asked for more detail, and given that he's a senior member, He is a senior member. It is the Chief Government Whip, and I try my best to obey whips. And yet, Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, because we're just getting to the interesting part now that Chris Tremaine has requested more detail on. The first of, I think, 4 key structural defects with the process of consideration of double tax agreements is firstly that there are supposedly network effects. That is, we are told by our officials, it makes no sense to consider one DTA in isolation from a whole spectrum of DTAs of neighbouring or related countries. And yet they are brought to the committee, often one at a time. How could the committee, how could Parliament possibly offer proper scrutiny of one DTA when it supposedly only makes sense as part of a network? That there's supposedly some separate headline negotiation or analysis that covers the whole system. It's just that it's not visible to Parliament and it doesn't come to the Select Committee. The second point is there is a lack of data. Let me give a very good example, not in particular in relation to the DTA covered by this clause, but one very similar, the New Zealand-Singapore Closer Economic Partnership Agreement. The NZ-Singapore CEP was described by officials as being likely to reduce New Zealand's trade in goods, but to expand its trade in services and its investment opportunities. Well, that's a perfectly reasonable trade-off to make, but guess what? The New Zealand Department of Statistics does not record data for trade and services or investment flows in sufficient detail to answer the question in the rear-view mirror, did we come out ahead? So 3 or 4 years after this Parliament passed the New Zealand-Singapore Closer Economic Partnership Agreement, it cannot even now undertake the analysis to find out whether the New Zealand taxpayer, the New Zealand economy, is better off or worse off because the New Zealand government does not collect the statistics that would enable that analysis to occur. And I find that absolutely amazing. However, it gets better or worse. Even if we have the data, we should not expect anybody in officialdom to have crunched it, because the national interest analyses are an analysis-free zone. An analysis-free zone. They are narrative descriptions of we trade this bit for that bit, we think we might be better off. Okay, tell us why. Tell us why you think that. And you know, there are no numbers typically in a national interest analysis on a double tax agreement such as those covered by clauses 102 and 103. Well, that is ridiculous, Mr. Chairman. How can it be an analysis if it's qualitative on a tax treaty? Or in one, which I recall, there was an upfront loss of tax of $20 million. That was the cost side. On the benefit side, there was supposedly a qualitative compliance cost reduction. Well, how big is it, we asked. Can't tell you, said officials. Well, is it bigger or less than 20 million? Can't tell you, said officials. Why can't you tell us, asked the members of Parliament. Is it a secret? Well, they said, there's 2 problems with that, and that brings us to the 4th of the 4 reasons why these clauses are an embarrassment for the government. Not only is there a network effect, not only is there a lack of data, not only is there a lack of analysis, but hey presto, there's a lack of process too. And the lack of process is that there is no point in the chain of the negotiation where the essence of the negotiation is able to be subject to sufficient public scrutiny. Because the government's negotiators go in secret to negotiate with the negotiators of the other party, and they do not bring the bill to Parliament until after it's negotiated. Fair enough, but there is no tracking analysis brought to the Select Committee. It's only brought to the Select Committee for analysis after the negotiation's completed. And when, in one occasion, we found a clear example where the negotiation had come out badly for New Zealand, we were told we can't say that. Why couldn't we say it? Because we don't want the other side to know they won. And in another example where it came out very well for New Zealand and the public would want to know, we were told, you can't say that. Why not? Because we don't want the other side to know they lost. Then why are we doing this? We asked. And we were told, because you have to. And we were told, well, shouldn't it be meaningful? And here we are today in Parliament under urgency on Christmas Eve now re-correcting clauses 102